How does that affect our conversation about that? Because if you come at it at saying, we want to give you as much leeway as possible to own this, but it has to be this box that we've pre-constructed, you've almost cut off that process connection.
Well, I think that was another segue.
Yeah.
How do we respond to the challenges? Because so many of our challenges were about stakeholder engagement, messages. How do we get people engaged and interested and part of this project is in terms of the wider community. So let's open up that question for comment. Yep, Peter.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to will certain things. Like everybody sort of knows how to do rational stuff pretty well. But the non-rational stuff is where leadership really comes in. There are two areas I think that we need that is in, well-informed, good values, but also charismatic political leadership. That's one thing we have to look for. And then the other thing is, really great art, because the way what we're really talking about, what Leonard was mentioning between people who have and people who don't have, people who have stuff are not thinking about where somebody else is getting their milk. So in order to break those social class barriers, or not break them, just to trip over them, you need either to be expanded through art or political leadership.
The dilemma with political leadership, and again, I don't know Poughkeepsie or Dutchess County, specifically, but oftentimes a community conversation about what those outcomes need to be provide political cover for your political leaders to do the things that they would like to do, except they have constituents that might not agree with them or might not understand why that makes sense. So we've seen much more political leadership come from the clarity that comes from how a community has the conversation about making the same movie than a political leader as bringing that clarity. And that's just my personal experience. And so I think you've got to be careful thinking about, well, there's somebody there that's going to do that. Because what that does, though, that oftentimes then gives that person, whether they exist or don't exist, the veto on whether you move forward. So it's how do you move that forward so then you create a place where those political leaders can exert that leadership.
The other thing we do have, we have some good political leaders, but we don't have a really dynamic, charismatic political leader. We have good artists and stuff like that. But what we really do have, I think, in Poughkeepsie, this is not an official statistic, but I think we have in my experience, we have the highest degree of charismatic, eccentric, non-aligned people that I've ever come across. So there's all this energy, and it sometimes sort of snuggles up against institutions, but the institutions are less impressive than the sort of the wilder side of Poughkeepsie.
Well, I would love to say, how do you take that wilder aside, that non-aligned, and create a powerful gravitational force that pulls them in that same direction? Because ultimately, without that, you're going to be fireworks, which really look beautiful, but they go out very quickly. Saying, how do you take that same light and create momentum and something that's kind of pitons on the mountain to make sure that your children's children aren't having to talk about hunger-free community?
What would that look like, Jen? Do you have an example?
Yeah, I think,
Could you just
yeah.
describe an example?
We have lots of examples, and I think what's really cool about this week here, and I'm looking at it from my vantage point, here in Poughkeepsie, Dutchess County and that, is we're having conversations here around hunger-free, we're having conversations around education, conversation around housing and homelessness that we talked about, is that how do we then have a community conversation about what does that all play out to what Poughkeepsie, Dutchess County, take that frame, that community frame, what should that look like? And that then could be charging and engaging for those entities to say, here's our piece that we can pull and reinforce each other in terms of getting to that outcome. So again, you were talking about, vaporware to some extent, just ideas. But on some level, it's how do you get that same sense that transform community energy from pushing against, or rolling the boulder up the hill, to how do we make sure that that boulder is aligned so it'll roll down the hill by itself? And so,
Is there an example you can think of a project or
yeah,
a group that did exactly what you just?
yeah, I would go to our website. I'd go to Cincinnati. I'd go to Erie. I'd go to Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. There's a lot of them that are listed on our websites. And I'm not saying don't have political engagement. You have to have political engagement. But don't wait for this leader to self-select, because we haven't seen that. We really haven't seen that as a sustainable issue, because sometimes that leader then gets voted out. And then all of a sudden, well, their stuff wasn't really good, so we're not going to reinforce that. Ultimately, you're talking about how does the community own that place that it wants to create? And that's a conversation that the community, just think of yourselves, just forget about coming to this meeting, but the community itself doesn't think of itself as hunger or not hunger, doesn't think of itself as well-educated or not well-educated. It thinks of itself more holistically and then says, now how do we address those things to develop a better, stronger community? So it's more aspirational.
So let's move into our last question, because we're in the last few minutes
Yep.
here, which is, what does success look like for this advisory team? What role can we play in trying to make these things happen?
I think the problem of hunger has no correlates, and getting back to the point Leonard was making in terms of attracting people to the positive aspects of solving the problem of hunger. And you alluded to it earlier. There's a real decaying of community when people are hungry. I think if we could frame the question in that way, that hunger is almost like this umbrella, and it creates petty theft, it creates safety issues, it creates
Educational outcomes.
education, yeah, obviously.
Creates a drug trade for people to get money.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's enough under that umbrella to engage all the different interests in the community, to recognize if we can, eliminate is pie in the sky, I think, but if we can reduce hunger to to some degree, eliminate it if possible, of course, it will have ramifications in all those other interests in the community.
The NAP model, you were looking at models, that Hunger-Free Heartland would be a really good model.
That's from Nebraska.
Yeah, that's the Nebraska one. And that's on my website, but I actually think it's hungerfreeheartland.org. What's valuable about that is then they had that community conversation that was very much about what are those connections, what are those things that are implied because you're hungry. And then what they did is say, and here's what we're going to do in our first year, and it became very specific in terms of what those actions are that are going to move in that direction. So I think that's that delicate balance that you have to have, is that you have to have that aspirational, hunger-free, with that clarity that by the end of year one, here's what success looks like, and how's that measured, how's that known.
We had a coalition on healthcare, and we actually were able to measure how that coalition working together resulted in people entering a medical home. And so I would measure the success is that this advisory team coalition continue past the time of the funding, which we were able to do with our HCAP coalition, and that we really make a difference in the lives of the people that we want to impact, and that somehow those of us working in direct service know that through the work of this advisory group, we have knowledge, we have information, we have resources that we can refer the people who need them to, and somehow measure that through some kind of process.
There are, anytime you have this collaborative cross-sectoral work, you need to have process measures and performance measures. Right. What you just talked about were, process measures, does this last beyond the funding cycle? Is it able to self-sustain? But you still have to have the performance measures. It's not just that they got to a medical home, it's that as a result of getting to a medical home, their health outcomes did what? And so that's the why is that important? Why do we need to know, or how will you know? So that's a performance outcome. And the process outcomes, so an evaluation model for this type of work has to have both of those.
Couple more quick comments, then we need to wrap up.
I almost think that the indicator that we need to measure is how much have we empowered the community to stand on its own and be sustained. I mean, that is the longest achieving success that we can aim for.
Right. And then the question is that how will you know that? Because I don't disagree with that as being a measure. That's really, you're talking about transferring ownership. But then the question is, how will you in a concrete way know that? And that then becomes more difficult.
So I guess we come up with indicators that tell us how we've been able to empower, or how this community has become empowered as a result of this.
And I would still see that as a more of a process, important process measure. But ultimately, the reason why a community is empowered or owns it is that fewer people are hungry. So it's, how do you know fewer people are hungry is the performance side of that measure.
Josh, and then we'll.
It strikes me, and I don't know what the focus groups have been focusing on, and I haven't seen the survey, but it strikes me if we ask the question that if the supermarket's closed tomorrow and I couldn't use my car and I couldn't leave the city of Poughkeepsie, what would I eat? You know, how would I get the food and what would it be? And then if I were to ask the question, okay, now you have that, what would you want it to be? That would give a much clearer idea of how we as advisors could pool our resources and work towards achieving a goal that's already sort of agreed upon by the community, and would sort of have a framework for what do the people of Poughkeepsie want their food system to look like.
Yeah.
And the other thing as far as reaching out to people who don't necessarily have food insecurities, I was actually speaking with an organization called the Greenhorns, who do sort of farming sort of things. And my point to them was that in talking about small-scale agriculture, for instance, there's an important tie-in between food security and sort of national security issues and small-scale agriculture towards crisis. Like the question as far as if I couldn't leave the city of Poughkeepsie because I couldn't use my car, is not necessarily because maybe I'm poor, or maybe I don't have a car, or maybe I can't afford groceries. Perhaps it's because there's been a crisis in our area, and those food resources, which we so rely upon, being trucked in for thousands and thousands of miles aren't available.
Exactly.
What would our local food resources look like, and how can we sustain ourselves in the crisis?
And we're seeing some really powerful work in that way. I wanted to just comment one thing on surveys, and I know you're doing a tremendous amount of surveys, and surveys are very important. Unfortunately, surveys really go to the extent of the present knowledge or the present experience base. And so if people feel constrained, well, I've never seen the ability to do this before, they're going to allow that to be their filter, their governor in terms of as far as their recommendations are going to go. So I think the surveys help with a real good baseline, but then the kind of conversations that Susan was talking about that would go beyond that to say, what would be, in your wildest dreams, what is your aspirational type of thing, could then affect that in a different way. Because you don't want to just say, how do I get the present system to work better? Because in many ways we know that that present system is limited and constrained in and of itself. So the question is how do I get to that result? And many times it's impossible, and I'm going to defer to you, but many times it's impossible for a survey to have that aspirational idea or framing. Would that be right? Yeah.
We, in our project, we've actually, there was a point where we thought we had 2 surveys, and then the other would be, the vision. And
Yeah.
I think there's maybe a little survey exhaustion.
Exactly. Absolutely. And I'm not sure whether that conversation isn't better in a forum environment.
So we need to wrap up. I promise to let you go at 11. It's a little bit after 11, and one more slide. I actually need to dismiss you, so you can
Yep, I've got to get to another.
He's got to go speak at 11:30, another event, and they're probably answering.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.